So today my talk is titled 5 Lessons About Life and Ultralearning. So I've spent the better part of the last decade writing and thinking about the question of how to learn better. And I'd like to share some of what I've uncovered with you so that you can learn things better in your own life. But before I jump into the lessons, I have 2 quick points I want to make. So the first point is, as soon as I start talking about learning, some of you are going to automatically think school. And that's unfortunate, not because school isn't important or it doesn't matter, but because it's just such a narrow part of what I'm talking about when I talk about learning. So to understand that, think about the last time you got a new job. You had to learn new tasks, roles, how to work with clients and colleagues, or when you went on a trip somewhere, you had to learn new people, places, cultures, cuisines, maybe even a language. And if you do decide to start a new business, you're going to be learning constantly, or your business isn't going to be around for very long. So the truth is that learning impacts our lives all the time, even if you're never going to set foot in a classroom again. And so I think it makes sense to try to understand that process, even just a little bit, so you can learn things better and get better at the things that matter to you. So the second little point is that I titled this talk 5 Lessons About Life and Ultralearning, which raises an obvious question: what the heck is ultralearning? So it just so happens that I wrote a book about it. I spent the last few years researching and writing this book. It's going to be coming out in August for those of you who are interested after this talk. And beyond the book, though, ultralearning has had a profound impact on my life. And I think it could have a profound impact on your life as well. It's had a profound impact on many of the people I met in the course of researching this book. People like Eric Barone, who was working minimum wage as a theater usher and went to becoming a millionaire after spending a lot of time painstakingly developing the skills of game design and releasing a best-selling game. Or people like New Zealand librarian Diana Faisenfeld, who, when she was reaching near the end of her career, decided instead of becoming obsolete, she wanted to become indispensable. And so she learned statistical programming and data visualization to take her librarian skills and upgrade them to the internet age. Or people like Nigel Richards, who won the French World Scrabble Championship, even though he can't speak French. And so I think I'd like to give you an impressionistic journey of what I mean by ultralearning and why I think it matters to you over the course of this talk. But I think just to make sure that we're all on the same page, it would help to have a definition. So ultralearning is a strategy for learning that is both self-directed and aggressive. So what do I mean by that? Well, self-directed in this context is kind of the opposite of what we typically think of when we think of education, where you show up to a classroom and a teacher tells you what to learn, how to do it, and often you don't even really know why. Self-directed learning, in contrast, is when you are in charge. You decide the project, you decide how you're going to learn, what you're going to learn, and most importantly, you know why you're learning because you're learning something that you care about. Aggressive learning in this context merely means it's focused on what gets results, even if that can be a little bit scary or frustrating at first. So with this definition in mind, I'd like to get to my first lesson. The hard way is the easy way. And to understand that, I'd like to tell 2 stories about learning 2 different languages at 2 different points in time: French and Spanish. So the first story of learning French happened to me about 10 years ago. I was in university, and I had the opportunity to study abroad for a year in France on exchange. So I was super excited. This was going to be my first chance to live in another country. I was going to be able to eat croissants and baguette every day and drink French wines. But on top of that, I had a secret goal because I wanted to come back speaking French. I thought that would be so cool to spend a year abroad in another country and come back and be able to speak the language. I wanted to parler en français. Now, flash forward 4 months, and things don't seem to be going that well. I'm near the bottom of my French class. I think I even got a D on my final French exam. And everyone around me speaks to me in English, including the French ones. And so, suddenly it started to feel like a year just wouldn't be enough. And so maybe the problem was just that I had too high expectations. I mean, most people spend years learning a language before they're having conversations in it, so maybe that was my problem, that 12 months just wasn't enough. Or maybe the problem was me. I mean, I was always more of a math and science student in school, and so, maybe I just don't have the gene for learning languages or the ear for picking it up. So as I was complaining about this state of affairs to a friend back home, he introduced me to someone who would forever change how I thought about life and learning. Now, some of you may even recognize this person because he has spoken on this WDS stage before. His name is Benny Lewis. So this has become somewhat of a famous point for Benny, that he does these fluent in 3 months projects, for those of you who haven't heard of him, where he goes to new countries and tries to learn as much of a language in a short period of time. But this was 10 years ago, and he had just started his blog, so I was extremely lucky that my friend had found out about him and had been able to introduce him to me. And like most people who you see someone do something so much faster and seemingly effortlessly than you're doing it, the first thing I thought when I heard about Benny's challenges was, that's bullshit. There's no way you can learn a language that fast. I've been in France for 4 months, and my French is garbage. So how can someone try to learn a language and even try to attempt something like fluency in as little as 3 months? But after that first reaction, I decided, you know what, I'm going to try to keep an open mind. Maybe Benny understands something about learning languages that I don't. So an email and a train ride later, and Benny and I were meeting face to face. And the thing that I learned from our conversation wasn't that Benny had some magic trick for learning languages, some secret shortcut that allowed him to learn it so much faster than everyone else, but that his entire philosophy towards learning languages was different from mine. You see, while I was studying at home, timidly trying to prepare so that I could be ready to talk to people, Benny was fearless, having conversations with people even though he very clearly wasn't ready. Often going up and having conversations when he just learned a few phrases from a phrase book a few moments ago. And so I took Benny's advice to heart, and when I went back and continued studying French, I do feel like I got to a reasonable level after my year spent in France. But I also had this feeling that much more was possible. You see, if you go to another country, and if you've ever had this experience before, and you want to learn a language, but you don't speak it now, you'll experience what I call the English bubble. And this is a very common experience, because when you land in the country, even though everyone around the country speaks it, you don't. And because you don't, what are you going to talk to people when you first arrive? Well, you're going to speak to them in English, right? And because you speak to them in English, slowly but surely, you form connections and friendships that all know to talk to you in English, even if they speak the language you're trying to learn. And soon enough, this becomes a bubble so that when you want to practice the language, you actually have to work at it, because everyone around you talks to you in English all the time. But what if, I thought, you didn't make this mistake? Now, I'd already had my experience in France, so there wasn't much I could do beyond just try my best to push out of it. But what if you never let that bubble form in the first place? What if you only spoke the language you were trying to learn from the very first moment you stepped off the plane? So this brings me to my second story about learning Spanish. So this is now several years later, and I'm living in Vancouver with my roommate. He's pictured here, Vat Jaswal. And I've been working as a writer online, and my friend has been working for a few years as an architect and saved up some money, and he wants to go on a gap year before going to do his master's. And so because I could work online from anywhere in the world, we talked about the possibility of traveling together. And around this time, I told him about my experience learning French, both of being able to get to an okay level, but also of believing much more was possible. Now, naturally, he was a bit skeptical at first. I mean, going to another country and only speaking a language that you don't speak right now, that sounds kind of scary and frustrating, and maybe it wouldn't work for him. But over many conversations over several months, I managed to persuade him to give it a shot. And so we decided to use what I call the no English rule, which means that as soon as I got off the plane, we would not speak in English to each other or to anyone we would meet, except for a few emergencies. And so, sure enough, a few months later, we were landing in Valencia, Spain, to learn Spanish. And I got to be honest with you, it was difficult in the beginning. It often felt like we were cavemen, grunting and pointing at each other in order to communicate. I felt like whole conversations were done on our phone, where I would type something into Google Translate, it would spit it back out at me, I would say that, then he would take that sentence, type it into Google Translate, and read what it said in English. And so it was difficult. But that was just the first 2 weeks. And then something funny happened. It started to get a bit easier. And after a month, we were socializing, making friends, even going on dates. After 3 months, our Spanish was better after that brief period of total immersion than my French had been after an entire year in France. And so the point I want to make is not really that immersion works for learning a language. I'm sure you probably already knew that before I went on the stage, even if you've never learned another language before. But I want to tell you something that's actually kind of counterintuitive, that it wasn't just that it was more effective. It was easier, too. Because while I'd been in France, everyone was used to speaking to me in English. So that meant that every time I wanted to practice, it was a deliberate effort. I had to force myself to try to speak in a language that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. In Spanish, because we had this habit from day one, it meant that even when our ability was really low, we still had the ability and habit to speak in this language that we were just learning, and so it was never an effort. It just felt natural. And this difference in learning style isn't just a matter of learning something a little bit faster, because we didn't just go to Spain. After we went to Spain and completed our 3-month project, we did it 3 more times, going to Brazil to learn Portuguese, China to learn Mandarin, and South Korea to learn Korean. And this wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't been using the right approach. And so the point I'd like to leave you here isn't even really about language learning, because language learning was what interested me, but I care about what interests you. And so what I want you to think about is, think about the goals and projects you have. What would you do, how would you do things if doing them well were all that mattered? What if you didn't get frustrated or worry about getting rejected or have fears or frustrations? How would you approach things? And the idea I'd like to leave you with is that the hard way might not just be more effective, it might also be easier than you think. So this brings me to my second lesson: a little fear is very useful. And for this lesson, I'd like to tell a story that took place in between my experience in France and in Spain. So I just graduated from university, and I was feeling a bit of regret about what I chose to study. You see, I had always wanted to be an entrepreneur, particularly have my own online business. Maybe like many of you, I thought it would be so cool to be my own boss and live and work from wherever I want to in the world. And so when I was going to university, I wanted to pick whatever would help me achieve that goal the most. So I decided to study business. What else to study if you want to start a business but business? And it was only after a couple years that I realized, actually, business school is mostly about how you can be a good little middle manager in a large corporation, and not really about how to start your own company. So I was feeling a bit of regret about this. And I thought back to when I was a freshman and still deciding what I wanted to study, and the other thing I was thinking about studying was computer science. And now that seemed to actually make a lot more sense, because after all, in computer science, you actually learn to make things. You make programs and websites and algorithms and maybe even artificial intelligence. And more than that, if I wanted to be an online entrepreneur, everything I would do would touch computers and software. So even if I never became a full-time programmer, really understanding that would probably be useful. But I mean, do I really want to go back to school for 4 years? I want to take out more student loans and extend my life and live in a dorm room? Well, not really. And so while I was debating about what to do about this in my head, I stumbled across a class taught by MIT, but posted online for free. So here's an example of such a class. And this was the actual lectures MIT used to teach their students, along with the actual assignments and exams and even the solution keys. And as I was playing around with this class, I realized that actually, this is a lot better than a lot of the classes that I took in school. I mean, it wasn't just that it was free and accessible, but it was actually higher quality as well. And as I went through these classes, I realized that it wasn't just one class they'd uploaded. It was many. Perhaps even most of the classes that for the subject I wanted to study had at least some materials posted online. And as I was going through this class, I realized that it wasn't just even that it was cheaper and more accessible, but actually there were some places that you could maybe even learn a little bit faster. I know that sounds a little crazy when I say it, but I want you to think about it. When you're attending a class in school, you have to show up to the lecture at the assigned time and sit through the whole thing, even the boring parts. If you're watching a lecture video, you can download it and watch it at a slightly faster speed. And don't worry, if you get confused, you can always just pause it and rewind. Or think about assignments. Normally, you would do the whole assignment and submit it, and then wait maybe a week to get your feedback. Whereas this way, you could do each assignment one question at a time, quickly learning from your mistakes and getting the material. Even exams, the things that all students dread, could be a lot simpler because you could just do one whenever you were ready. And if you failed it, you could just try again later with an alternative exam. And so the thing that got me interested in this wasn't just the class, but thinking, if you could learn the content of a class, why not an entire degree? Why go back to school if you could maybe learn the same content on your own? And around this time, I also thought about my first introduction to this strange world of ultralearning, Benny Lewis. And I thought about how he not only set these ambitious projects to learn hard things, but that he also set himself tight deadlines and that he blogged about them publicly so that not only he would be accountable and could focus on the project and stick to it, but also other people could see what he was doing. And so this got me interested and inspired to do something I called the MIT Challenge, where I wanted to learn MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum by passing the final exams and doing the programming projects. But instead of trying to do it over 4 years, I wanted to try to do it in 12 months. Now you can see me here studying for these classes. And you know what? When I started to tell people about this idea I had for a project, I got a pretty common response. Ugh, that sounds really scary and frustrating, and why do it that way? I mean, why set a deadline for yourself like that? And most importantly, why try to do the whole thing? Why not just learn a few of the classes as you're interested? And I didn't really have a great answer for them then, but I do now. Because we tend to think of fear and anxiety as always bad things. I mean, they certainly feel like bad things, don't they? But actually, if you look at what's going on in your body, fear is actually really close to another emotion, excitement. They both involve what physiologists call the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. This is that thing that makes your heart race a little bit and you're focused down and you're able to get to work. And so, yes, I was a little bit scared and I did feel that feeling of fear, but I mostly felt excited. And because it was really exciting, I worked really hard. I prepared for 6 months, and when I actually started, I put in lots of hours to try to reach this goal that seemed so interesting and exciting to me. And after a year, I was able to reach it, and I finished my goal of completing all the classes. So you can see me here standing next to my stack of textbooks. Thank you. And so my lesson here is, again, not that you have to go out and do your own MIT challenge. That was what excited me. It doesn't have to excite you. But rather, to realize that fear and excitement are a lot closer than you think. And that a goal that doesn't excite you, a goal that doesn't scare you, rather, also won't excite you. And if a goal doesn't excite you, you won't be motivated to work hard on it. Now, if this is where this story ended and I just learned some computer science in an unorthodox way, I would have been very happy. That was the reason I took the project. But something interesting happened because other people started to find out about it. I was invited to give a TEDx talk, and I was offered to give an interview at Microsoft for a job. A startup wanted me to join their team. Even a publishing company in China offered me a book deal to write a book about studying. And so the lesson I want to give here is not just that you should pursue goals that scare and excite you, but also that goals that excite you will excite other people as well. So this brings me to my third lesson. Feedback is good, so ignore most of it. And so this story I'd like to tell not something that happened to me, but something that happened to someone I was working with in the process of researching my book. His name is Tristan de Montebello. And so we had been friends for a long time, and as he heard I was writing this book, he said, you know what, I want to try an ultralearning project too. And what I'd like to do it about is public speaking. Now, he had done a little bit of public speaking before, he'd done a few presentations in college, but they didn't always go so well. He told me one story about delivering a speech at a startup in Paris, and he told a joke, and nobody else laughed, so he laughed to fill the awkward silence. But this time, he was prepared to work hard on it, and work hard he did. It impressed even me. He was speaking multiple times a week, sometimes even twice per day, video recording every performance, going up to the audience, getting feedback, seeking advice from a diverse range of people. And his progress actually amazed me, because it wasn't just that he got a little better at public speaking. In fact, in less than 7 months, he went from that low starting point to being a finalist for the world champion of public speaking, which is a competition put on by Toastmasters every year that has over 32,000 people competing in it. So there's a lot of things that I think you can learn from Tristan's project, but I want to focus on feedback. Because Tristan clearly got a lot of feedback, and that was clearly very important for his process. because he was getting live speeches, actually talking to people. He would go off and ask for suggestions after each of his speeches were done. But when I asked him about how he used this feedback, he told me something interesting. He said that he often ignored the suggestions people gave him about what to change about his speech and instead focused on the consistency of those suggestions. So he quickly learned that if he just followed everyone's advice, he would quickly get thrown in the wrong direction. However, he learned that when his speech wasn't very good, the advice would be all over the place. As his speech got better and better, the advice started to get more consistent. And I thought this was really interesting because it was something that jived with what I understood from the research on feedback. So just a little bit of a flashback. I'm starting to write this book, and I decided to do some research on feedback. I'm thinking feedback is really important. I'm going to look at the science, and it's going to say feedback is always useful. And it turns out that that's actually not the case. So in a comprehensive meta-analysis done by the researchers Avraham Kluger and Angelo Danesi, they looked at hundreds of different studies that involve feedback and learning. And they found that in actually 37% of cases, feedback actually had a negative effect, meaning that if you gave someone feedback, they learned worse. So what's the reason behind this? Well, one of the reasons is that sometimes feedback isn't very helpful. So you can all remember that time that a teacher, a coach, or an employer said, you know what, you're no good at this, you might as well just give up. Well, I mean, that was feedback too, but it probably didn't motivate you to learn very hard. Interestingly, from this study, they also found that praise also has a negative impact. So even though we all like to hear how great we are, it turns out that this also has an effect on motivation, which makes it harder to learn well. And so the interesting thing here, I thought, was that this actually really jives with a lot of the research jives with Tristan's experience when he was working on his speech, that he went and got lots of feedback. And the reason why is that feedback is scary and useful. And because it's scary, that can often be the reason why it doesn't work, because we're so afraid of receiving feedback, or we react to it so strongly that we get overwhelmed and it sabotages our motivation, that feedback can be a downside. But somewhat ironically, the way to get over that is to just get more feedback. So if you're afraid of feedback, if you're afraid of standing on a stage like this one right now and giving a speech, the best way to do that is to stand on a stage and get feedback from the audience. And so getting more feedback is very useful. But at the same time, you need to learn to ignore the feedback that isn't helpful, just the way that Tristan filtered the suggestions and focused on the signal that mattered for him to improve. So this brings me to my fourth lesson. The shortest path is straight ahead. And once again, I'd like to tell a story, but this story is not about me. This story is about Vat Jaswal. This is the guy who I went on the trip with, learning languages. Now, this actually took place a number of years before we went on that trip, after he had graduated from architecture school. And unfortunately, he was graduating in the middle of the Great Recession. And so when the economy's bad, they don't want to build skyscrapers. When they don't want to build skyscrapers, well, architects have a hard time finding a job. And this is exactly what Vat found. He started by sending his resume to every single firm in the city. No response. When that didn't work, he started showing up uninvited to architecture firms, pleading to speak with whomever's in charge to give his portfolio a look and give him an opportunity to practice the profession that he'd worked so hard on. Nothing. And so I think a lot of people in this situation would want to blame the world around them. And I mean, this is a pretty easy thing to do. When Vat looked around, none of his peers that he graduated with had found a job in architecture yet. So this was a pretty comforting thing to believe. But Vat was different. You see, from the little snippets of feedback that he could pry from people that he talked to at these architecture firms, he realized it wasn't just that there weren't that many jobs, it was that they didn't see him as a valuable candidate. They thought it would take months of training to get him up to a point where he could produce useful work, and that just wasn't a luxury they could afford. So Vat decided to start his own Ultralearning project to get better at the skills that would allow him to find a job. So his starting point was to get a job at what's called a large form print shop. This is the place where they print large pieces of paper, like the kind for architectural blueprints. And from that, he was able to study how architects drew their buildings on actual blueprints. Not just the big abstract ideas of design, but little details too, like what codes did they use to represent materials, or how did they draw doors and stuff. And he added to this working on the actual software used in architecture firms. So you can see him here with the application Revit. This is a 3D modeling software that's used in actual architecture firms. And so combining these two things, he built a new portfolio with a building of his own design, done in the style that was actually used in architecture firms, using the software that they actually practiced. And this time, instead of taking this portfolio and submitting it to everyone in town, he submitted it to just 2 firms. And to his surprise, they both offered him a job immediately. And so I think there's a lot of lessons, again, that you could draw from this, but I want to focus on one that maybe you hadn't considered. You see, if Vat had gotten so much better at his architecture skills in such a short Ultralearning project, what the heck was he learning in school? I mean, he had spent... he had spent 4 years studying this in school. Why had that not helped him get a job? And the answer actually has something to do with what psychologists know as the problem of transfer. See, transfer is when you try to learn something in one context, say a classroom, and you want to apply it in another, say in real life. And what psychologists have known for decades is that this is actually really hard to do. So some examples. In one study, students who took a high school level psychology class did not do better at college level psychology classes. In another study, economics majors did not do better on questions of economic reasoning than non-economics majors. And I mean, this is pretty obvious stuff that you should be able to transfer, and yet it's quite difficult to do. To quote one of the researchers who has studied this in depth, Robert Haskell, it is, without a doubt, an education scandal. And so how can you apply this lesson to the things you're trying to learn? Well, the first thing to do is to realize that transfer is really hard. And so if you want to learn something well, you should learn by doing the thing that you want to get good at. So Vat practiced the actual buildings that they were trying to design and used the software that they actually used. When Tristan wanted to get good at public speaking, he gave a lot of speeches. When Benny Lewis wants to learn a new language to have conversations, surprise, surprise, he has conversations with them. So you can apply this, and if you do, you might find that the shortest path really is straight ahead. And so for the last lesson, I'd like to bring up a quote that has always meant a lot to me. So this is by the motivational speaker Zig Ziglar, where he says, "Happiness is not pleasure, happiness is victory." And this quote has always meant a lot to me, and I would like to, with all due respect to Mr. Ziglar, amend it ever so slightly. Because my 5th lesson is, happiness is not pleasure, happiness is the expansion of possibility. Thanks. And so just the same way that when you go on a trip, it's a lot easier to talk about the places you visited and the sights you saw than to talk about how those things made you feel. It's a lot easier for me to talk about the outcomes of these kind of projects, about winning competitions or getting new jobs or learning a new language. And it's a lot harder for me to talk to you about how these projects made these people feel. And that's unfortunate because in some ways the outcomes are kind of beside the point. You see, I was having a conversation with Tristan de Montebello. He's the guy who did the public speaking project while I was preparing for this talk. And he told me, you know what, it wasn't so much that he felt great about learning public speaking, but that doing this project totally made him rethink how he will approach any project he does in his life. And that learning this skill, he thought, what other things could I learn that I thought were impossible for me before? And so the point I'd like to leave you with today is that your best moments in life are not going to be coming from when you get a reward, but from when you see the possibilities for your future life expanding. And so when Tristan told me this was something that resonated with me because when I did my MIT challenge, my feeling wasn't, oh great, I'm learning some computer science, I sure hope that's useful. But rather, why did I ever think that I had to go to school to learn something well? And if I could learn this, what other things could I learn that I thought were too hard or frustrating or difficult for me before? And so when you're approaching your own ambitious projects, maybe even an Ultralearning project, I want you to think, if you could do this, what else could you do that you didn't think was possible before? And if you do that, you might ask yourself, who could you become? Thank you.